Okay, now we're going to have a look at the poem Cetacean by Peter Redding. And as ever, a good place to start is with the title. Now, cetacean is a scientific word, it's a scientific classification of marine mammals, and that includes whales, dolphins, and porpoises. Interesting to think why Peter Redding used this. And you'll note throughout the poem that there is a very precise way of observing these creatures. It is at points almost scientific. He doesn't launch into a lot of hyperbole or flowery imagery to describe the whales that he sees. Instead, there is this absolute precision, and there's something in that, I think, which conveys his respect and admiration in rather an understated fashion, perhaps. So let's get into the poem itself. Out of Fisherman's Wharf, San Francisco, Sunday, early, our vessel bow to stern some 63 feet to observe blue whales. And we did, off the Farallones. So here we get a real sense, I think, of the excitement and anticipation felt by the speaker of the poem, by Peter Redding, I think we can say. And you can see here the use of multiple commas, which act as these little caesuras or pauses. I'm just going to write that word in here. So a caesura, just as a reminder, is a brief sort of pause within the middle of a line of poem. And here, all of these sort of multiple caesuras continuing into line 2, really, I think, give this opening stanza an air of sort of breathless excitement, we could say. As though this sort of anticipation is so great that sort of giving full sentences would almost be too much. It's just these sort of details coming quickly, one after the other. I think that builds his sense of excitement and anticipation. Notice as well what I was talking about earlier about this sort of the precision. It begins even here, not just when he's describing the whales, but notice how bow to stern, some 63 feet. You know, this is a very precise measurement of the boat. This is clearly somebody who has sort of keen powers of observation and notices details, which is exactly what we would want, I suppose, when we're about to read a description of what he's seen. You know, that precision is really what allows this experience to come to life on the page, I think, through some very clever use of language. And we'll note here that in the third line, so in the first two lines, we've got this sort of this breathless excitement, the sort of the build up, if you like, of all these details, where he is, when it is, and then we get to the third line and we discover what it is precisely that he's doing: to observe blue whales. Okay, and you'll notice he's capitalized blue whales, and I think, you know, perhaps that could be said to show their significance, and perhaps their, as we see later, some of the power that they have, and certainly the respect that Peter Redding feels towards them. And unlike in Watching for Dolphins, where we spend the entire poem waiting to see if something's going to happen and eventually it doesn't, Peter Redding doesn't keep us in suspense. You know, he says, and we did. Okay, so notice this brief, you know, monosyllabic words, which, again, perhaps sort of just emphasize the sort of the sense of excitement and the sort of the thrill of this. And we did. You know, he's really happy, I think, that this happened, and he's about to tell us about it. So off the Farallones. So this, or Farallones, I think, actually, because it's been Americanized. And now he tells us a little bit about these whales that he sees. They were swimming slowly and rose at a shallow angle. They were grey as slate, with white mottling, dorsals tiny and stubby, with broad, flat heads, 1/4 their overall body length. So again, it's not very sort of flowery language, although there are little moments, I think, that we could pick up on where he's using language in a creative fashion. So the first instance that sort of jumps out of me is this alliteration here, swimming slowly. In fact, it's or we could say it's sibilants, actually, and I think that sort of helps emphasize the gracefulness, perhaps, of the blue whales. as they sort of swim up near the boat, they're swimming slowly and rose at a shallow angle. So again, notice how precisely he is describing this, the shallow angle, sort of the way that perhaps this also creates a sense of anticipation. You know, if they're rising at a shallow angle, they can be seen sort of underwater gently and slowly beginning to make their way towards the surface. And again, it's because Peter Redding is able to describe with such precision that we're able to sort of see this picture so vividly. There are lots of things in here, by the way, which we can sort of take into descriptive writing as well, into our own descriptive writing. So let's see what he says. Now he puts this next little bit in brackets as though to say, you know, this information is so precise, so detailed. It's almost it's almost so detailed that it's just a sort of an afterthought. It's not necessarily something that's going to help convey the experience. But actually, I think it really does. Okay, because let's look at what he says. They were grey as slate. Now, this is a simile, obviously. Grey as slate. He's sort of comparing the colour to the sort of the dark colour of slate type of stone. But again, it's very sort of subtle, I would say. We could say it's understated simile, and I think again it's sort of it helps actually in a way convey his sense of, or even more. It's as though simply by describing them as they are, he shows how impressive they are. He doesn't need to exaggerate. He doesn't need to sort of to describe them in these sort of wild or extravagant ways. It's simply by describing them as they are that he's able to convey how magnificent they are. So he talks also about the white mottling, so sort of little patches of whiteness, dorsals tiny and stubby. Now these are sort of small fins that are about 3/4 of the way down the back of a blue whale, the dorsal fins. And notice how he calls them tiny and stubby. It's a sort of stark contrast, I think, isn't it, to their kind of overall size, which we hear more about later. And does it perhaps, tiny? Does it give them a sort of little bit of a sort of a delicate air as well? You know, obviously not something that we would normally sort of associate with a blue whale, the idea that it could be delicate in any way, and stubby as well, with broad flat heads, 1/4 their overall body length. Okay, so again we see this precision, you know, as he did with the boat, in terms of sort of describing its length very precisely. Here he's giving us a very precise description of kind of the size of their heads relative to their overall body length. And again, I think just by observing them so keenly, so closely, Peter Redding's able to sort of convey how impressive he finds them, because he's so rapt by them, R-A-P-T, that he's sort of able to observe them so precisely, so keenly. And now he goes on into the third stanza. They blew as soon as their heads began to break the surface. The blows were as straight and slim as upright columns, rising to 30 feet in vertical sprays. Now, I think it's quite interesting here that again, the way that he describes the sort of the water coming out of the whale's blowholes is as upright columns and straight and slim. There's a sort of neatness, I think, here to them. And again, he gives us a sort of a precise measurement, rising to 30 feet in vertical sprays. I think, you know, that's quite an impressive sort of thing when you think about it, to be able to sort of shoot up water for 30 feet into something that is so sort of straight and narrow that it can be described as an upright column, sort of gravity defying. Again, and vertical obviously helps emphasize that as well. Again, shows just the power, I suppose, of these cetaceans, of these blue whales. Interesting as well, he notes, going back a bit to the first line of this third stanza, they blew as soon as their heads began to break the surface. So again, you know, notice the precision, you know, as soon as, it's, you know, he describes everything with such painstaking, careful detail. And also he started to call them they, and they, and they. We see, all of these repetitions of that word, I think, just shows how entirely sort of focused he is on watching them, on watching these dolphins, and sort of being able to describe them precisely. And then he continues, then their heads disappeared underwater, and the lengthy rolling expanse of their back hove into our view, about 20 feet longer than the vessel herself. So almost as soon as they appear, they sort of begin to disappear again, and the lengthy rolling expanse of their back hove into our view. Now, hove is a very sort of unusual word. It's a past tense, but a rather sort of old-fashioned past tense, I suppose, of heaved. Okay, so I think, if we consider the effect of that, well, let's think about the word first itself, heaved into our view. I think that helps sort of show the size and power of these creatures, as they sort of heave themselves into view. But also, I think the fact that he's used this rather sort of old-fashioned or unusual version of the word perhaps helps emphasize how strange and unusual this experience was as well. The word sort of slightly stops us in our tracks. That's a bit unusual. And in the same way, I think he's been utterly stopped in his tracks by witnessing this majestic sort of group of blue whales. So they hove or heaved into our view about 20 feet longer than the vessel herself. Now notice how he's put the vessel, so obviously that's the ship that they're on its own line, and it's the shorter line, which I think perhaps we could say mirrors the shortness of the boat, the size of the boat relative to the whales. And I think that perhaps emphasizes again just how how sort of vast and magnificent these whales are. The fact that they're so giant, they're considerably longer than the boat itself, 20 feet longer than the boat. And then the diminutive dorsal. So now we've gone from the sort of the vastness of them back actually to diminutive. So that means, something quite small, and note the alliteration as well. Almost gives it a kind of cute sound, doesn't it? The diminutive dorsals. So he's emphasizing again the contrast perhaps between the vastness of the blue whales overall, but then the sort of the delicacy of the details, if you like. And in this case, he's talking about the fins. The diminutive dorsals showed briefly after the blows had dispersed and the heads had gone under. So again, notice how precisely he's seeing them, how specifically. He even notices these little dorsal fins as they showed briefly. They're not there for a long time, and even then he's sort of able to spot them and see them. And the heads, the blows had dispersed and the heads had gone under. And then they arched their backs, then arched their tailstocks, ready for diving. I think the repetition of this very sort of powerful verb, arched, is quite significant. And I think, it conveys the sort of the power again, but also actually a grace to them. This idea of arching their backs. It is simultaneously, I think, quite powerful and graceful. You imagine almost like a sort of, a gymnast or something like that. And they arch their tailstocks. So the tailstocks, the huge tails, and again, definitely worth doing a Google image search, perhaps for blue whales, to see what they look like. They were hugely impressive creatures. The tailstocks ready for diving, and then. The flukes were visible just before the creatures vanished, slipping into the deep again at a shallow angle. Now, there's an intriguing, I think, contradiction within these last two lines. So he talks about the flukes. So again, this is a reference to the tails of the whales' tails. The flukes were visible just before the creature vanished. Again, I think vanished sort of emphasizes the speed, perhaps. They didn't just go, they didn't disappear, they vanished. Bam, they're gone. But then this is where the contradiction comes in, and I think it's quite interesting. It sort of says, slipping into the deep again at a shallow angle. Now, these two words are opposites, really, aren't they? And it's quite sort of interesting to think about what the significance is of that fact. So they're slipping into the deep again at a shallow angle. Is that even possible? Well, let's think about it. You know, ultimately, these blue whales, you know, do live in the depths of the ocean, and the fact that they're able to sort of access those depths, even by sort of moving at a shallow angle, it is a sort of funny contradiction. But again, I think it just shows, you know, even while moving at a shallow angle, their sort of their power will get them down into the depths again. Certainly, it's something I think to consider and to note. You know, even if you don't draw an absolutely sort of firm conclusion about what the effect is, it is fun, I think, to note this slight sort of contradiction or this sort of interesting tension within the final couple of lines. The only other thing I think I'd comment on here, possibly slipping, you know, I think again that sort of goes or sort of forms a bit of a pattern with some of the other verbs that we've seen, you know, arch, showing the sort of the gracefulness of them. Hove, we've talked about. Slipping, you know, it's sort of actually surprisingly gentle, isn't it, for such vast creatures? And maybe that's actually the point here, is that they're able, as well as being so huge and impressive, they do have a kind of a gentleness to them as well, slipping, and thinking back as well to the dorsals, tiny, and the diminutive dorsals. So there's this sort of simultaneous sort of power and grace to them. And I think through his precise observation of the whales and of their environment, Peter Redding's able to convey just what a sort of mesmerising experience this was for him. I hope that was some help, and as ever, please do feel free to leave questions or comments below, and I'll do my best to get back to you. All right.